Welcome everyone to another installment of the Kellogg Lecture Series. I'm very excited to introduce James Adams to our today's lecture today. So James is a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science at UC Davis. And his work specializes in voting behavior, party election strategies, and political polarization. He earned his PhD from the University of Michigan and has published extensively on affective polarization recently. So I really highly recommend, for instance, his Cambridge Elements called American Affective Polarization, Comparative Perspective, which really is the resource right now to understand political polarization, not just when we think about polarization in the US, but really from a broader comparative point of view. Just because some people may be following online, if you want to ask a question, there should be a box where you can just add your question, and we'll make sure that we'll ask this question here in the talk as well. Thanks so much, Tim, for being here, and take it away. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Mark, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Kellogg Institute for putting this on, and thanks to Teresa for seamlessly organizing everything. It's very impressive to be actually met by a driver at the airport. At Davis, we tell the speakers, well, give us your receipt when you arrive from the Lyft driver. So I very much like this. I've already had a chance to get to meet several of you, including, let's see, Luis, Dajin, Z, Adriana, Mark, and Joe. And just being here and being on campus here reminds me of something that I've always known. As Mark mentioned, I went to Michigan, University of Michigan for graduate school in the Midwest. But I'm from California originally, and I've taught at California universities my whole life. I live in the Bay Area now. When people ask me what it's like living in the Bay Area, I always say, well, it's nice. Of course, it would be nicer if we could move out a lot of the Californians and move in Midwesterners, because words like kindness, thoughtfulness, consideration, etc., apply very well here. Not always to the most highly teched up part of the world. So I enjoy this all very, very much, and I appreciate actually being here. So the research that I'm presenting today, you see the title here. Whoops, I go back to first slide. There we go. Okay. Is titled Who Attacks Whom? Conflict and Cooperation Between European Party Elites. And as you see, this is me along with a cast of thousands. And Josephine Andrews is my colleague at Davis. Well, she just retired, but former colleague. Let's see, Tamea Ballo, Graydon Davis, and Alexa Federice are three whip-smart UC Davis graduate students. Tamea has moved on now to a postdoc at Strathclyde University. Noam Gidron and Will Horn are now, well, my goodness, long-term collaborators with me. We've written many articles, and as Mark mentioned, that Cambridge Elements publication all about the topic of affective polarization. So what I'm presenting here is actually planned to be yet another one of these Cambridge Elements publications. Now, to explain this, perhaps for the graduate students who aren't aware of these, what is a Cambridge Element? Well, it's something that's too long to be an article, but too short to be a real book. They're typically 80 to 100 pages long. So there's a maximum of 30,000 words. I should mention that Cambridge insists we call it a book. I'd be inclined to call it a monograph, or my wife, when she wants to yank my chain, calls it a book. Something I'm handing out on a street corner, perhaps. But Cambridge wants us all to call it a book. They explained to me, if it's a book, they can charge more money. So Cambridge will go under unless we call this a book. The final draft of this manuscript is due, well, it's actually overdue, but we should be sending it in a couple of weeks, which means we still have a chance to make last-minute additions. And indeed, based on some interesting conversations I've already had with some of you, with Adriana in particular, and Dajin, who couldn't make it here today, I'm already planning to put some edits in the book. So very much looking forward to your comments, questions, anything that you find confusing, particularly interesting, or you disagree with, don't be shy about letting me know. I should mention one other thing. I'll probably be wearing my glasses during most of this, just so I can see this. With my glasses, I can see what I'm reading. There's a big blur in front of me right now. If you raise your hand and I don't respond, I'm not ignoring you. It means I don't see you. I don't see the hand. Move the hand back and forth. And like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, I can sense movement. And I can lock in on the target. But don't be afraid to do that. I'm also happy to send you this manuscript if you're interested. And again, the version we have now is probably about 98% identical to what will finally be presented. So with that, let me move on. And I see I've skipped gotten my slides out of order here. Well, I'll just go extemporaneously directly from the reading this. What we're trying to do in this Cambridge Elements book. And as it says here, what we're addressing really are the same kinds of questions with respect to political elites that affective polarization scholars have asked about ordinary voters. Now, I should say something. I'm guessing that 90% of you here have at least followed in some newspaper form literature on affective polarization. But if you haven't, just very briefly, affective polarization refers to citizens, in particular partisans' feelings of anger, distrust, oh, thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Distrust, fear, contempt, or even hatred towards political opponents, usually combined with some degree of allegiance or warmth towards their own political party. So we're instead looking at we're looking at politicians instead of looking at elites. And we're looking at politicians, and instead of looking at politicians' feelings, politicians are typically not very forthcoming in a way we would expect, to be honest, about how they feel. We're looking at their behaviors because that's what we can actually measure. So looking at elites' behaviors and using that as a proxy, we hope, for their feelings, we ask the following questions that are listed there on the slide. We look at a comparison across 13 European countries, and we're asking, if you look at the different countries, across countries, which party systems tend to feature a higher rate of elite conflict relative to cooperation, and which ones less? Second of all, tracking the same party system over time, in what time periods do we observe more or less inter-party conflict? And again, it's always relative to the amount of inter-party cooperation. Are there periods when elites are predictably more conflictual and less conflictual? And then third, we also look at comparisons between different pairs of parties in the same party system at the same time. And we ask which pairs of parties tend to engage in more conflict relative to cooperation and which less. Of course, you can do that in a multi-party system outside the United States, where there are more than two political parties and therefore more political parties. So you can look in Germany and you can compare the relationship between, say, the German Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, two parties of the left, and see how often they can publicly conflict versus cooperate. But then you can also look at the relationship between the German Green Party and the Christian Democratic Party, a party on the right. And you might intuitively expect that there would be more conflict in that second interaction, because intuitively you might expect that more policy disagreement implies more conflict. Although, as I will report later on, the evidence to support that particular intuition is surprisingly weak and inconsistent. So those are the questions that we're looking at. And I should mention, by the way, feel free, if you have questions while I'm talking, feel free to go ahead and ask. Don't feel you have to wait till the end of the presentation for that. And so let me talk briefly about the topic of why elite inter-party cooperation and conflict plausibly matter. And there are several intuitive reasons we would expect that it might. You might expect when there is too much conflict and elites from different parties are just unable to cooperate or rarely able to, you might expect more gridlock leading to the political system struggling to confront and solve important political problems. And of course, that's a view as a new double conflict is being handled. But the second point there is taking a different perspective, which is that at times elite conflict may be positive in that it can provide the citizens with meaningful choices and initiate important debates. Margaret Thatcher, former British Prime Minister, famously used to observe about British politics that political conflict and vigorous political contestation is necessary in a free society. If you're not having political contestation, it means that alternative points of view are not being espoused and debated and conflicted over. And Thatcher very much believed that post-war consensus in Britain after World War II during the 1950s and the 1960s was actually damaging for Britain. That politicians from different parties were doing too much to avoid conflict and endlessly compromising and trying to avoid controversial issues. She thought that this made the society stagnant. If you look at the United States, the civil rights activist and then long-term Congressman John Lewis used to talk about his policy agenda and what he wanted his supporters to do. And what he would frequently say is, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to cause trouble. Good trouble, necessary trouble. And essentially what he was arguing about is we have to move forward on civil rights. And if this makes some people uncomfortable and leads to conflict, so be it. This is necessary for social progress. So elite conflict need not always be negative. And then third, the public presumably reacts to what elites are doing. And indeed, there is some evidence that they do in previous studies. Some research that I've done with Chris Valazian and Simon Weschel suggested that voters use or citizens use public displays of conflict and cooperation between political parties to estimate how far apart the parties are ideologically. And controlling for what the parties actually say they stand for, citizens infer the parties are actually farther apart the more that they conflict. It may also affect citizens' levels of political satisfaction and satisfaction with democracy, whether they perceive in the elite landscape endless fighting or less conflict. And finally, we all suspect, although there's not yet a great deal of evidence, that what elites do affect people's feelings and affect the influence mass level affective polarization. And a couple of examples, recent American examples of this intuition, come from the one very sad event, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, another event which was the attempted assassination of then presidential candidate Donald Trump. And I'm sure we all recall that following these events, there were a lot of public calls from politicians too. We need to lower the temperature, that essentially we're creating this politically charged toxic atmosphere, and it can lead some nut job to do what some nut jobs actually did. So we all suspect that it matters for this reason. Note that elite level conflict and cooperation can also have consequences for politicians. And there's a marvelous paper that Mark has written with co-authors. Sean Westwood, I believe, is on the paper, and some others as well. They're analyzing the public behavior of politicians in the US Congress. And Mark, I've forgotten the exact adjectives you apply. I know it's not cooperation versus conflict, but it's toxicity or... Okay, yeah, the toxicity of these politicians' public behavior and public statements, their measure has face validity because the number one most toxic member of Congress, according to their measure, was Marjorie Taylor Greene, which felt about right. And one of the things that they show observationally is that members of Congress who behave toxically in public, on the one hand, they receive more media attention. On the other hand, they tend to get worse committee assignments in Congress, suggesting that the media reacts in a way that these toxic politicians might appreciate, but that their leaders of their party are nowhere near as appreciative. And let me mention just one final thing, even though this is going to sort of undercut the whole project I'm giving I'm going to discuss here. So I had dinner last night with Mark and Joe, and I'm not sure, is Joe here? Beautiful. Sorry, I told you without exactly. And Joe said something very interesting that I think applies to this project as well. And that's the following. Joe told me about an interesting conversation he had with Shanto Iyengar, who is widely seen as the father of affective polarization research. He's the one who first pointed out, look at these feelings and look at how much angrier Americans are now and how much they dislike their opponents. So Iyengar's work has been hugely influential. But Iyengar, as transmitted to me from Joe, was telling Joe 15 years later that Iyengar felt, well, on the one hand, I'm gratified that everyone is pushing forward this idea that I developed. On the other hand, we don't even know yet if political anger really matters, and if so, in what way. We've gotten a lot farther along at measuring political anger than we have at parsing out the consequences. I want to emphasize the same thing may well be true for this project. I've given you a list of reasons why intuitively elite conflict, public conflict, and cooperation matter. But we don't know for certain exactly how much they matter or how important it actually is. But we do feel fairly confident that it probably does. So, yeah, is there a, oh, I thought I heard someone. Okay. So let me tell you now.
Yeah, there is a hand there.
Oh, I'm sorry, there is. Okay, yes, thank you. Right, okay, perfect. I see you now. Yes.
I hesitate to ask a question when you're delivering such a beautiful talk. You pitched this as we're looking at conflict and cooperation as a proxy for feelings. And is that just a way of framing it, or?
So thank you, because even as I was saying that, it was going into my head, Jimmy, you shouldn't have said that. Happens to me way too often. I always worry in the lectures I give now in this politically charged environment in my class, I'm going to say something that will be videotaped, and I will, without unwillingly, become a star on Fox News, as either, liberal America hating professor, preaches heresy, or, something about fascist American professor preaches something else. So I think I made the sort of throwaway comment that we assume that elites' behavior is related to their feelings, but of course not always. And indeed, we suspect, I think, a lot of us, that perhaps much of elite public behavior is performative. And that's certainly true. So let me back away from that. I assume that in general, there is a positive correlation, but it's far from one-to-one. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. So with that, let me move on and talk about the specific questions that we're looking at in this Cambridge Elements, which can be boiled down to, we look at a series of what we somewhat pretentiously call structural variables. And we're asking which ones might be observationally related to an inter-party cooperation and conflict. And the first one we look at is political institutions. And this is a comparison between countries. Aaron Leithart has famously asserted that consensual political institutions that tend to feature proportional representation voting systems, multi-party governments, extensive protections for numerical minorities, and other features tend to promote kinder, gentler politics. If that's the case, whereas institutions like, say, in Great Britain with the single-member plurality of voting system, usually single-party governments supported by less than half the population and very few protections for numerical minorities, we might expect that that is going to be related in some way, shape, or form how much conflict we see in these different systems relative to cooperation. We all might also think that economic conditions matter as well. And this is a comparison you can make within the same country over time as the economy grows and strengthens, or when it weakens, perhaps to the level of a crisis. Intuitively, you might expect that, well, when times are tough and there are more difficult political choices to be made, that this will provoke more elite level conflict. Incidentally, you'll hear me tell you later on that there's some truth to this, but there's another side of it as well. Then we also looked at the variables listed there that involve comparisons between different pairs of parties in the same country at the same time. Well, the most obvious one here is party policy differences. I think we all assume that left-wing parties are going to publicly conflict more with right-wing parties than they will with other left-wing parties, and the same on the right. Parties' populist orientations. And here in Europe, the part of the world we're looking at, famously, a large number of mainstream political parties have erected what is typically labeled a cordon sanitaire against these populist parties, in particular radical right populist parties, essentially announcing we're not going to cooperate with them, we're not going to work with them, and we will never, ever, ever co-govern with them. So you might expect that there's something related to populism there and differing orientations towards it that's driving conflict. And finally, and last, most obviously, governmental relationships. I think we all expect that the parties in government and parties in opposition tend to engage in more conflict. After all, opposition parties are called that for a reason, right? It's because their role is to oppose, and they're expected to oppose the government. So you might expect that those things will matter. I should mention, of course, there are innumerable other factors that one could study, but we didn't in this project for one reason or another. You could look at the level of political corruption in the country. You could look at cleavages based on race, ethnicity, religion, geography, language, whatever. You could look at a country's democratic histories. I think that a country that was authoritarian within recent memory, that might have something to do with the present tone of politics. And last, and not only not least, but sometimes I wonder, maybe most of all, just individual politicians' personalities and personal style. If I ask the question to all of you, so why does Donald Trump act? And when I say act like that, what I mean is, he acts differently than almost every other politician does in the United States, although increasingly one sees other politicians emulating. Well, he's in the same country as these other Democratic politicians at the same time. So what's going on? I don't know what to tell you, except that Donald Trump is Donald Trump. It's not related to these structural variables. We're not investigating any of those things. I simply wanted to name check that they're plausibly quite important. Just sort of a last introductory part, and then I'll finish up with this. So as I've talked with some of you kindly mentioned that you'd read this earlier Gidron Adams Horn Cambridge Elements book, American Affective Polarization and Comparative Perspective. A Cliff Notes version of what we're doing here is we're trying to do for elite interactions what that earlier book did for mass level affective polarization. There we related levels of polarization across countries and across time to most of these same structural variables. Now we're doing it at the level of political elites and adding in a couple of additional things. Now, I don't know about your attitude when you attend one of these talks like you're at right now. But very often, at roughly this point in the talk, if I'm in the audience, I have to make a command decision. There's a decision tree. Path number one, I'm going to keep listening closely. Try to follow what the speaker is saying. Think about it and make sense of it. Path number two, the path of least resistance. I will sit here and comfortably digest my food, sort of warm, comfortable, drowsy feeling coming over me, and think about something more pleasant, maybe sports, for example. Well, I sympathize if you're trying to make that decision right now. By the way, the food looks delicious. So console yourself, whatever you think of this, you've already been well repaid for actually attending this. Let me give you a quick preview of our findings. And once I present you what they are, then you can make your own decision. Do these findings seem interesting enough to you that it's worthwhile for you to pay attention and find out how we reach this conclusion? And of course, you might want to think about, gee, what do these findings mean? Are these good news or bad news for democracy? So what we do in the study is we analyze 13,000 elite inter-party interactions. And we code these interactions as either cooperative or conflictual in 13 European democracies between 2001 and 2019. And these are all based on the codings of legacy news reports. Now, a bit later on, I'll explain why we're relying on legacy news reports and why we use the distinction conflict versus cooperation instead of toxicity or warmth versus coldness or something else. And incidentally, these are all interactions, and then I locked it on you, and I'll get to your question momentarily. Just one other clarification point. These are all in domestic politics. The data set we have actually chronicles interactions between elites in different countries, and we have a separate paper, several of the same authors as this one, about those. But here it's all about the level within the party system on domestic politics.
So sorry for interrupting.
No.
Did I miss the definition you're using for elites? At what level
Yeah.
do we stop considering politicians elites?
So I'm going to get to that when I talk about the media coverage. But basically, it's whatever the media decided to cover. The national legacy media, as you'll hear me discuss momentarily, these legacy news reports are heavily skewed towards party leaders and other highly visible political figures. And surely local politicians are vastly underrepresented in this. Now, in one way, you might say, gee, you're leaving out a lot of important stuff. On the other hand, if you're asking who's more central to politics or political conflict in the United States, is it Donald Trump or is it some obscure Republican member of Congress? So there is, or some state legislator in California or wherever. So there's an overwhelming focus in these media studies on national figures, ones who frankly make news, since we're basing this on media reports. So let me tell you what we find. And these are all in analyses where we estimate the observational relationship between one factor and the degree of conflict in a party interaction, while controlling for all the other factors simultaneously. So let me start with three here, about three very clear patterns about when elites are more likely to be conflictual. One is in more majoritarian systems, like Britain, with single member districts, single party governments, few protections for minorities, which provides a strong early clue that Leipart was right. He was on to something. Second of all, that there's more conflict between parties with different populist orientations. In particular, that mainstream parties are disproportionately hostile to populist parties. By disproportionately, I mean even controlling for their policy differences, which mainstream parties often present as this is why those radical right parties are unacceptable and are unfit to be in politics. Even controlling for that, there seems to be something about this clash of worldviews between the populists and non-populists and how politics should work that's driving some conflict. And finally, not at all surprising, but parties on opposite sides of the aisle. As you would expect, governing and opposition parties tend to be at each other's throats considerably more. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, well, so far so good, but so far so obvious. I didn't have to attend this talk to learn all this when I probably suspected a lot of it. So let me list now three other findings, which I think are less intuitive obvious. The first is the surprisingly weak relationship in these multivariate models between parties disagreeing on overall left-right ideology or on European integration. So we're looking at these European countries. That controlling for other factors The findings there are weak and in many cases, frankly, non-existent. But even when they're detectable, they're extremely weak. Based on this, it doesn't seem as though conflict is revolving around policy differences as much as I expected, certainly. Second of all, the economic recessions are related to higher levels of conflict, which has an intuitive logic. When times are tough and you have to make harder choices about budget cuts and so on, there will be more fighting. But when a recession tips over into a full-blown economic crisis, where the economy can almost literally collapse, a specter that Greece notably was faced with shortly after the onset of the global financial crisis, there's some evidence there, that detectable evidence, that politicians begin to cooperate. And finally, that a history of previous co-governance matters. And again, it's not just that are these two parties currently governing together or on opposite sides of the aisle, even if they're not currently governing together. If they've co-governed any time in the last 10 years, they appear to be much more likely to cooperate than to conflict, all else equal. Now, because I want to make sure I get through everything here without having to rush too much, I'm not going to give a detailed account of all of our theory and our hypotheses. In all of these cases, where all of these relationships between structural variables and political conflict, we develop theoretically grounded hypotheses. I'm not going to go through a lot of them because some of them are so highly intuitive. I don't have to explain to you why governing and opposition parties tend to be at each other's throats. And I probably don't have to explain the logic about why we expect that left-wing parties will have more fights with right-wing parties than with other left-wing parties, and so on. But there are three hypotheses that are less intuitive. And so let me say a word about each of these. The first is that we do develop a hypothesis expecting that when a populist party interacts with a mainstream or non-populist party, that there will be more conflict, even controlling for the degree of policy differences. And our argument here, largely due to my co-authors and not to me, Noam Gidron and Braden Davis in particular, who do research on populism. One of the things they explained to me, I should mention populism, 5 years ago, that was one of those terms like existential, that when anyone used it, I got uneasy because I hear it all the time, but I'm never sure exactly what it meant. But I think I understand now. But what we argue here is that populism is not just a different set of policies, it's a different view about politics. Populist parties are saying mainstream parties in the system are fundamentally corrupt servants of powerful, well-connected political insiders. As Donald Trump would say, that the system's rigged, folks. That's an allegation about the legitimacy of the system, less so than an argument about any particular set of policies. You might expect this to generate more conflict independently of the specifics of the policy debate. And then the last one is why we expect parties' past co-governance histories to affect their current interactions. Here it may be a little bit more intuitive, but I'll simply say this. If a pair of parties are not currently co-governing, but they were co-governing 3 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it is, well, number one, they may have had to develop a constructive working relationship in government to keep the coalition going, and they've simply developed, they've worked out how to cooperate with each other. But even if it's not about that, parties want to get into the government. And so if you're out of government now, and you look at one of your past coalition partners, you may think, you know, we co-governed before. I would like to co-govern with you again, or at least keep the option open. To do that, I have to maintain relatively constructive cooperative relationships. So those are the arguments on that. And with that, let me now move on to the data and the measurement to analyze this, the set of issues that I've discussed. And we analyze data from something called the Integrated Crisis Early Warning System data set. And what this contains are machine codings of event data about interactions between political and societal groups. In this paper, we're focusing only on the political groups, political parties, but it includes more. And in particular, this is based on the codings of news reports from legacy media. And the events, well, you see the details here, they're identified and extracted using a natural language analysis system. And the data set includes both domestic political interactions and cross-national. In this paper, we're only looking at domestic interactions between pairs of parties, leaving out cross-national interactions or party interactions with other actors such as labor unions, business associations, religious groups, and so forth. A few quick words about this data set. It was created by the US Defense Department, and apparently the goal of this data set or this project in creating it was the Defense Department thought it would be very handy to be able to project ahead of time possible political hotspots in different parts of the world. Where is conflict growing? And therefore something that could lead to a crisis that will necessitate a response from the United States. Where is it growing, and who are the actors who are involved in this conflict? It's actually used fairly extensively by international relations scholars who analyze the cross-national interactions to study all sorts of things. But we're looking at the United States. I should mention, sadly, the data does not include data on the United States, because apparently that would have constituted domestic surveillance. So I would have loved nothing better, I think we all would, than to study the United States here, but we're not able to do it. And we analyze all the coded interactions that are between two political parties in the same political system. So you see it here, that a given party I in country A. And in these interactions, one party is identified as the sender or initiator of the interaction, the other as the target and the recipient. And each interaction is coded as being either cooperative or conflictual. Now, just to clarify this, and I'm happy to take questions, actually, there are a couple of hundreds of codings of these interactions in the Integrated Crisis Early Warning System data set. For the purposes of our study, we broke these down into cooperative and conflictual interactions. I'll give you a couple of examples momentarily of what these news reports look like and how they're classified. I'll just mention that some of the codings that we put all under the bin of being cooperative interactions include praise, defend, consult, and congratulate. But there are many others as well. There are also a large number of coding categories that we classified as conflictual. This includes criticize or denounce, oppose, and accuse. To give you just one other more lighthearted example, another example we classified as cooperative was apologize. Another coding that we classified as conflictual was refuse apology. So at times, politicians apologize and the apology is not accepted.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
So
please.
in these examples, it seems like the interactions are discursive, and the things that are said, they're not actions.
Yeah, so they are, I'd say, mostly things that are said, but sometimes it's a party announcing an action. We are breaking off negotiations. We are leaving the governing coalition. So it's parties generally and politicians either talking and expressing an opinion or announcing an action that we classify as either cooperative or confliction. So it can be either one of these things. And these are over the period 2001 through 2019 for the following European countries. And note, there's a mistake on this table. You see the listing here: Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Hungary. No, I was creating this slide just as Viktor Orban was meeting his political Waterloo, and so Hungary was on the brain. But they are ejected from the study, just as Orban has been ejected from government in Hungary. And that should actually say the Netherlands. So it's the Netherlands and not Hungary. Just a couple of other pieces of information I won't dwell on. If you're interested in this data set, it does cover a few other Western democracies, notably Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. They're outside Europe. We wanted to study interactions where we could study whether and how differences in European integration matter. So, but that data is there, it's perfectly usable. If you're wondering why Italy isn't in our data set here, we would have loved to include Italy. The integrated crisis early warning system coverage of Italy in the data set is surprisingly sparse, number one. But number two, as you probably know if you study Europe, the Italian party system is a nightmare to study because new parties are always forming, old parties are dying, existing parties are merging, or parties are changing their name. We need to be able to track the same parties over time. And this made it impossible for us. Let me give you just quickly some really simple examples of what these news reports look like and how they're classified. And the two I'm going to give you here are both from Britain. They both involve an interaction initiated by the British Conservative Party or a politician in that party against a politician from the Labour Party. They're both from the same time period, just a couple of weeks apart in 2014. And so we see here that in the first one, in a polished and at times emotional speech that closed the party convention, Mr. Cameron mocked Labour and its leader, Ed Miliband. David Cameron was the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister at the time, and Ed Miliband was the leader of the Labour Party. So the way that this is coded as, it's coded as the Conservative Party, because Cameron is a conservative, initiating a conflictual interaction towards the Labour Party led by Ed Miliband. This was from October 1st, 2014. The other second one, an example of a cooperative interaction, was when David Cameron, once again, a busy time in his life, apparently, congratulated Alistair Darling as partial results indicate Scotland had voted to stay in the United Kingdom by a clear margin. Cameron, again, leader of the Conservatives and Prime Minister, Alistair Darling, a prominent member of the Labour Party. So that's the Conservatives initiating a cooperative interaction with the Labour Party. Now, as you're probably gleaning from this, these kind of news reports are just the day-to-day stuff of politics. You open up the newspaper, well, nowadays you click on the screen to see your newspaper, and the headlines are constantly saying this, right? It's always some politician denounces or criticizes somebody else, or some politician praises somebody else. You read the headline and then decide if it's worthwhile to invest in reading the whole story. That's largely what's being chronicled in this integrated crisis early warning system data set. So with that, let me give you a list of the variables that we have in our study. The dependent variable, I listed this as the quality of the interaction. I probably should have said the nature of the interaction, but this is simply a binary variable that can take on the value 1 if the interaction was classified as conflictual and 0 if it was classified as cooperative. And note here, we're taking these hundreds of codings and collapsing them in the most simple way possible. I don't know how else we can do it, because you'd have to tell me whether criticize or denounce is worse than refuse apology or is worse than break off negotiation. So we decided to play it safe and use something that we felt comfortable with. The independent variables include the country's degree of consensualism or majoritarianism based on the country scores based on Leiphardt's executive party's dimension. And again, this is something where a very consensual country will feature a highly proportional voting system with multiple parties in government, frequently many parties in government, that collectively represent a majority of the population, extensive minority protections for numerical minorities, and so on. The majoritarian ideal is Britain, with a single member district plurality voting system, single party governments, usually supported by a minority of the population, and very few protections for numerical minorities indeed. We also have the country's level of unemployment. We have monthly levels of that. That's what we're using as our measure of economic conditions. We also have measures of the party's distances on Euroscepticism and the left-right distance. In most of the book, we use the Chapel Hill expert surveys, where experts in the country were asked to place the country's parties on scales relating to overall left-right, to Euroscepticism versus being very supportive of European integration and so on. The big alternative, which we also used, are manifesto codings. As I'll explain later on, we got the same results either way. Governing status, and we use ParlGov for this to denote whether a party's in government or in opposition. I'll explain later. The actual variable we had is the pair of parties that engaged in the interaction co-governing? Are they both in opposition, or are they on opposite sides of the aisle? And finally, populist party. And here too, we decided to do it very simply, use a binary indicator that a party is populist or not. We used this measure from so-called B party. And we used a cutoff of 0.7. We tried different cutoff points. It didn't matter. For your information, using this cutoff point, all of these radical right parties that we tend to think of, they're all classified as being populist, as well as some left-wing parties, like in France. There's a party called France Unbound. And we also did robustness checks using many alternative operationalizations of these variables. So our entire book is basically based on multivariate analyses. Nevertheless, I want to show you some bivariate relationships for two reasons. The first is that the bivariate relationships, for the most part, tell a really clear story, and this story will survive the inclusion of all the control variables. The same thing you see bivariately. That's even a word. We also tend to estimate when we control for everything simultaneously. So this is a preview of coming attractions. But point number two is this. As I've mentioned, we're using this measure based on legacy media reports. I can give you some of the reasons why we did it. We can all think of reasons to worry, right? That the media is cherry picking what stories to cover, that they systematically distort, even if it's unintentionally or something else. What I'm going to show you here, I think most of you will find highly intuitive. You would say this makes sense. And I'll simply make the following sort of modest argument in favor of using these data. If these data on conflict and cooperation based on media reports was all noise, or mostly noise, then I don't see why we would get these highly intuitive relationships that I'm actually going to show you. But you, of course, can make your own judgment about that. So the first I'm going to show you relates the rates of conflict within different countries to the country's degree of majoritarianism or consensualism. And sort of take you through this, the vertical axis here is the rate of conflict relative to cooperation in each of our 13 countries across the 2001-2019 period of our study. So what you're seeing with the UK up there is that about 55% of the coded interactions that were coded as conflictual or cooperative were coded, in fact, as conflictual. You'll see that France also has a high rate of conflict, as does Spain and Greece. On the other hand, look over here, the Netherlands. No, they're definitely not Hungary, ladies and gentlemen. You see that the Netherlands has an astonishingly low level of political conflict, at least based on these legacy news reports, as does Finland and Belgium and Portugal, Austria, Denmark, and to a somewhat lesser extent, Germany. So that's the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is meant to capture the country's degree of majoritarianism or consensualism based on Leiphardt's measure. It's something called the executive party's dimension. The far end are the most majoritarian countries. And so you have Britain as the most majoritarian. It's the one Leipart uses as the exemplar in his book to exemplify what majoritarian political institutions are. And you have France, which is also significantly majoritarian. At the other hand, you have examples that are much closer to the consensual end of the poll, such as Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium that all feature highly proportional voting systems, multi-party governments, and the other attributes I've already discussed. Well, if you look at this chart, what I like about it, it's my favorite figure in the book. A couple of my co-authors wanted to take it out of the book, and I had to say over my dead body on this case, because it tells a story, doesn't it? What you see is this extraordinarily strong relationship where the more consensual countries display strikingly lower levels of political conflict than the more majoritarian countries do. The correlation is about 0.8. So that's a very strong relationship, suggesting not just that Leipart was right, the consensualism promotes kinder, gentler politics. He was really right. And it's a really, really big deal. And that latter point, again, to the extent this is a causal relationship, we don't know if it is. That's what surprised me, not that there is a relationship, but just how strong it is. Let me show you relationships based on parties governing relations relative to each other. And what this is telling you is that if you look at all the interactions between pairs of parties that are both in government, about 25% or a little less were conflictual, the rest were cooperative. The same for interactions between pairs of parties that are both in opposition, but that parties from opposite sides of the aisle conflict at much higher rates. What is it? It's over 50%. Probably no need for me to say more about this. This is highly intuitive. If we hadn't found this, you might have questioned the validity of our data. I'll simply point out, but we did find it, suggesting that the data is capturing something real in the way that politics works. Let me now show you some party interactions subdivided according to the party's populist orientations. And over here, we have interactions between two non-populist parties. And you see a little over 45% are conflictual. Here you have interactions where the populist party initiated an interaction against a non-populist party. You see it's about the same. Here are interactions where a non-populist party initiated an interaction against a populist party. And what you see is that the level of conflict jumps, which of course is consistent with this phenomenon of the cordon sanitaire that these non-populist parties have erected against populist parties in many countries. Although in some cases it is starting to collapse and we're seeing more cooperation. Incidentally, if you're wondering what happens when two populist parties interact, we have only 5 cases in our data of over 13,000 observations for that. So we can't really tell you very much about that. And finally, let me show you and again, everything I've told you so far, I hope is highly intuitive, although I hope or sort of suspect you may be surprised as I was, just how strong the relationship is of more consensualism is associated with kinder, gentler, or at least more cooperative politics. I was very surprised by that. Last one is a first really crude way. Oh yeah, sorry, question.
First, there's some that's not intuitive and really to be congratulated, like populist source being particularly conflictual.
Yeah.
And what's your understanding of that?
Right. And so that is interesting, isn't it? Because if populism is not so much a fight about policy as a clash of worldviews or a clash of here's what democracy is supposed to be, then why aren't populists being nasty to non-populist parties? I honestly don't know. I was frankly surprised by that. One reason I'm glad we did the study. You know, I learned some things I didn't expect. I was utterly unsurprised to find that non-populist parties attack populist parties at very, very high rates. Let me just mention one other point about this, which is not answering the question, but taking it to the level of the mass public. You know, this finding about how elites are interacting actually mirrors something that Noam Gidron, Will Horn, and I report about mass level feelings in our paper titled Who Attacks Whom? Which was the inspiration for the title here, Who Conflicts with Whom? And what we found there was that supporters of non-populist parties expressed distinctly more dislike of populist parties than supporters of populist parties expressed back towards non-populist parties. So I don't know why that's the case. If Noam Gidron was here, who knows a lot more and has studied populism, he might give you a better educated guess. The one thing he said to me in conversations is, you know, Jim, and this is at the level of the mass public, the people who support these populist parties, they tend to feel disrespected and looked down on. That they think that other people disapprove of us, or you know, in some way, shape, or form, think that we're not worthy in some way. And Gidron's comment was about this as well. Maybe they have a point. They are, at least, they receive more dislike at the mass level and more conflict at the elite level than they send back in return. But it's a good point. I honestly have no idea. And with that, let me move on to the last bivariate relationship, which is a very first crude way. We use a much more sophisticated way later in the paper of trying to figure out whether parties' left-right differences are related to their rates of conflict. And what this is showing you here are interactions between political parties classified according to whether they're in the same ideological bloc. We broke it down into a left-wing bloc, which, as I recall, was social democratic parties and green parties, and a right-wing bloc of conservative, Christian Democrat, and nationalist parties. That's obviously pretty crude, and later we used these actual exact parties' estimated measures using the Chapel Hill expert surveys. What this is telling you is that parties from opposite sides of the ideological spectrum, when a left-wing party interacts with a right-wing party, the rate of conflict is a little below 50%. When two parties from the same bloc, two left-wing parties or two right-wing parties interact, the rate of conflict is a bit lower. It's a little above 40%. The fact that there's less conflict within blocs will not surprise you. I at least was surprised that the difference wasn't starker. I guess, like many political scientists, I'm always used to thinking of things in terms of left and right. And so I sort of assumed this would be a dominant factor. I should mention here, not only are the differences quite modest, this is the difference, of course, and leaving out of account all the other things about which parties are in government or opposition, and so on. This finding, which is surprisingly weak, or relationship surprisingly weak bivariately, basically goes away completely once you control for other factors. The main reason there's any difference at all is that parties from the same bloc often co-govern together. You know, left-wing parties prefer to co-govern with other left-wing parties, not right-wing parties. We find that that factor does affect rates of cooperation, but if you take, say, two opposition parties and are trying to predict how likely they are to cooperate versus conflict, the fact that one pair of opposition parties are far apart and another pair are close together, according to all of our estimates, that will have very little impact on their rate of conflict. So with that, let me move on and I see, by the way, let me try to hurry this up because I feel like I'm already a little bit over. Just briefly present you with the specification that we use, so you sort of can figure out what we're doing in this manuscript. And incidentally, I should mention, if you're interested, I'm happy to send you the manuscript and you can look through all this for yourself. So our unit of analysis is each interaction, and we run a load model where we're trying to predict whether a given interaction is classified as cooperative or conflictual or cooperative as a function of the variables I've already given. The executive party's dimension score in the country, the unemployment level, We also put in unemployment squared to try to capture the effect of crises, because we hypothesize as the economy goes from good to okay or poor, conflict will go up, but then conflict will go down during a national crisis. We have the left-right distance and the European integration difference, whether the initiating party is populist, the target party, and then these variables about being in co-governing or being both in opposition. We also, as I explained, control for pairs of parties that are not currently co-governing, but have co-governed at some point in the last 10 years. And again here, trying to go through a little more quickly now so that I leave time for questions and discussions. Let me just tell you what our key findings are. And the good thing is these bivariate relationships gave you a very strong preview of coming attractions. And all of these now are the relationships as estimated in these multivariate models while controlling for all of the variables simultaneously. So number one is that elite interactions are far more likely to be conflictual in majoritarian systems. It's just a massive difference. You saw it on the scatter plot. That difference persists once you add all of these controls. Also between parties on opposite sides of the aisle, which is a totally expected finding. And they're also much more likely to be conflictual when a non-populist party targets a populist party. That's the cordon sanitaire. Elite interactions are somewhat more likely to be conflictual, and that we have a detectable relationship, but one that's substantively modest. As the economy slides from a strong economy into a recession, but not when it becomes a crisis. When a country's economic system is on the verge of collapse, as Greece was around 2009, 2010, and 2011, we actually find an increase in cooperation, presumably because elites have to cooperate across party lines for the country's survival or the survival of their economic system. However, as it says here, there are only weak and inconsistent relationships between interparty conflict and parties left-right and European integration differences. What I can tell you there, and I'm going to skip this part so that I leave plenty of time for discussion, is the following. We ran a whole lot of robustness checks. We have a whole chapter on robustness checks using all these alternative measures of our independent variables and also different ways of using these legacy, these codings and media reports to estimate the degree of cooperation and conflict. Sometimes left-right distance and European integration are statistically significant. Sometimes they're not. They're never substantively significant. Even when you can detect the relationship, it's very, very, very small, especially compared to things like the country's political system, majoritarian versus consensual, or between whether parties are on the same or on opposite sides of the aisle. So with that, I'm going to skip the next slide. Well, I'll put it up for 2 seconds just so you can see the kinds of robustness checks we ran. And there were some other interactions in the data set that you could that we left out of our study, that you could sort of see as being neutral. Although frankly, to me, they didn't even look like interactions. When you add those in, it doesn't change our conclusions. I won't even bother about the stuff within indirect relationships. We also had a bunch of different alternative measures of our independent variables, and we ran these analyses omitting one country at a time. The findings on institutions, the governing relationships, and populism were always the same, or substantively the same, regardless of how we measured any of this stuff. On economics, the findings go away if you take Greece out of the study, which I think makes sense. That was the one country that was closest to collapse. You take that out, you're going to get a different relationships. As I mentioned, the estimates on left, right, and European integration differences are always weak and inconsistent. They're never substantively important, even when you can detect. So with that, let me move on to the big takeaways. If you're talking to this afternoon and someone says, I missed the talk, what did I miss? Well, you may just say, well, you missed a good lunch. But let me tell you what you missed, at least from what, or they missed from what I said. I'm trying to really highlight these different findings. Now, as I've already emphasized, everything we present in the book, it's all observational. We have not even taken one step towards establishing causality. Nevertheless, to the extent these findings are causal, which we have not proved in any way, shape, or form, Leitpart is really right. That consensualism, it promotes much kinder, gentler politics. Honestly, to me, that's the number one takeaway. If this book winds up being influential, there, I called it a book. If this booklet winds up being influential, I think it's going to be because of this. It's going to rise or fall on whether people buy this, and if so, if they think it's really as important as I do. We also find that populist parties receive far more conflict from non-populists than they send out in return, and that this is not entirely due to their policy differences. In fact, it's not mostly due to their policy differences. The intuitive story I would tell you is that the populists are pointing at the non-populists and saying, look at those corrupt servants of powerful, well-connected political insiders. Look at how illegitimate the system is and look at how illegitimate they are. And the non-populist parties don't like it. And they're reacting and they're being hostile largely because of that. They don't feel that it's not all about just, well, these policies are too extreme or these parties are racist. To the extent that policy differences like left-right ideology or European integration incite conflict, this is mostly indirectly through the fact that our birds of a feather ideologically tend to co-govern together. And we do find that governing relationships are strongly related to rates of cooperation and conflict. But again, if you take two parties with the same governing relation, two pairs of parties with the same governing relationships, two pairs of opposition parties, then the fact that one pair of opposition parties has big policy differences and the other that's small, observationally is not related to very much conflict. This may be too optimistic. I say some evidence of elite altruism, they cooperate more during economic crises. We must work together. So you can call that altruism, or you could just call it the survival instinct. You have to work together. So that may be too, and that parties' governing relationships matter in the way that we might expect. The only sort of additional insight we hope we provided is, but look, it's not just if you're currently co-governing. If you co-governed 5-10 years ago, that's still going to show up in your current levels of cooperation. There's one more set of sort of discussion topics I thought I'd raise, but let me just say something that's probably become obvious here. What we've done here, if we have accomplished anything, is one of the first words on comparative studies of elite level conflict and cooperation. Just observationally, what is related to elite conflict and cooperation? One of the first words, far, far, far from the last word, because we haven't established causality. We haven't looked at a lot of other variables like corruption, linguistic, regional, ethnic differences, and so forth. And the other thing, trying to be appropriately modest about what we've done, remember what I said at the beginning. We're studying elite interactions, conflict, and cooperations. For me, I suspect it matters for all the reasons that I outlined at the beginning. I think we all suspect it matters, but we don't know. We don't know for certain how it matters, in what way it actually matters. So there's so much more that needs to be done. And with that, let me finish up. Last slide to come, folks. And then I'm happy to have a more general discussion here. Let me raise two normative questions. And let me mention that actually here, this is not so much me talking, this is Mark Jacob being a ventriloquist and talking through me, because Mark has very kindly read the entire book and extensively commented on it. And he raised a number of things that I think are fascinating. And when I read the comments, I was almost ashamed this hadn't occurred to me because he's so right. The first is, and we've already covered this a bit, we find that populism seems to matter, and it seems to matter more than policy disagreements if you're trying to predict an inter-party conflict and cooperation. Is this disturbing? And I think, Mark, you suspect that it is. And a number of people I talk to saying, well, that may be the way things are, but I don't like it. And I think the intuition is no. Politics is supposed to be a battle of policy, policy viewpoints and policy debates. That's a legitimate function of politics. So I don't like it that they seem to not be fighting over that, and they're fighting over this populist thing instead. That's one perspective. An alternative perspective is to say that this debate over populism is a conflict of ideas as well. The populists will essentially, they do assert the system's rigged, folks. It's corrupt. It's not serving ordinary people. These corrupt political insiders and the non-populist parties who represent them, they're not doing what politics and a political system is supposed to do. Well, it feels to me like that's a legitimate debate to have about whether politics really should be primarily or entirely about representing the desires and interests of ordinary people, doing what the people want, ignoring experts, ignoring a lot of other sources of information. But this is one you can see both ways, and I think most people see it the way, Mark, I suspect that you see it. The second issue, and I think this one is just crucial, and Mark, I've spent much of the last month rewriting the book to address this second question here, has to do with when is a lead inter-party conflict normatively desirable, when is it undesirable? I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, and for the graduate students, this should be an example, or perhaps yet another example, of how us faculty, even as long-term faculty, have massive feet of clay and essentially have these huge blind spots. The whole time I was working on this project, up until about 3 months ago, I didn't even think about it. I just assumed elite level conflict was bad. I just sort of instinctively, maybe it's because of what we're seeing in the United States now, but I just thought, I look at the US today and I think, please just make it stop. But Mark pointed out quite correctly, it ain't necessarily so. Margaret Thatcher thought that elite conflict or vigorous political debate was necessary for a free society. John Lewis thought it was good to create trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. And, if Rosa Parks is sitting in front of the bus and she's ordered to the back of the bus, what should she do? She could think, I'm going to move to the back of the bus because to do the opposite would cause trouble. It could lead to conflict. This could become politicized, and we don't like conflict. It's a good thing she didn't do it, right? Because you can argue this conflict was a debate and an argument, or if you want a fight, we needed to have to move society forward. And you could say the same thing about a whole lot of conflict. So that's a crucial issue. We don't address it in the book, but I think it's very, very important. Future research, one is to check out alternative data besides these legacy news reports to measure elite level conflict and cooperation. I'm actually working on that right now, working on a joint project with others, looking at taking these news reports and comparing it to what politicians say on social media, to party press releases, and to parliamentary debates. And I should mention, if you think multiple measures are necessary, as I certainly do, Mark and Sean Westwood, and I think there's another co-author, have a marvelous paper where they look at four different dimensions of elite level conflict. Of course, we've talked about this in terms of conflict versus cooperation. There's other dimensions you can break it down, right? Is the conflict toxic, for example? Is it warm? Are the relationships warm or cold? Are they constructive or destructive? And finally, and most obviously, this is a book reporting observational relationships. My view here is, hey world, here are some observational relationships, at which point I'm going to sit down, perhaps eat my own lunch, and hope that other scholars will be intrigued enough to say, okay, let's see if this is causal. And fingers crossed that other scholars do it. It'll be very interesting at that point to try to figure out what's causal and what isn't. And with that, I'll stop, just say, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, Joe.
Thank you, Jim. It's terrific
Thank
that you guys are doing this, and thank you for giving up your week to come talk to us about it.
Oh, delighted.
I want to try and make myself useful, probably in vain, on your populist finding, because the story doesn't sound straight to me. Maybe that's because I'm misunderstanding you, or maybe because together we can make it straight. But the basic idea you said was populistic, the system is rigged. And so they're delegitimizing the system. But the non-populist elites don't like that.
Yeah.
And they fight back and say, I'm not illegitimate, you're illegitimate. And then they fight. The dog that's not barking is that you don't have populists as a source attacking legitimacy in your data. So one way to talk about this is that the populist message to the masses is what you say it is, and it says it is.
Right.
But the populist message to elites is not that.
Yeah.
And then this is a revealing thing about what the strategy of populism may be, that instead of trying to take the castle by storm, they have to play ball or try and get it through subterfuge or try and flip people on the inside because they can't get the levers of power unless it's through the standard.
In the rest of time, we want to take more questions.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. Let's take more questions, maybe.
Oh,
Okay, let me shut up there and
let me, so take a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let me
I think it's consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I just think you're playing it up as if the elite populists are talking smack about the elite non-populists, and they are not. That is not in your data as far as I can see.
Thank you. Yeah. Z?
Thanks. It's a very interesting project. And what I have in mind is, given the nature of the data, is it possible that we see so few cases, only 5, of populists fighting against populists because we do not have a adequate language to report those kind of conflict? Because non-populist attacking populists is a label. Populist is something that we can call out. And non-populist attacking non-populist could be on other issue dimensions we can call out.
Right.
But what can populist party attacking another populist party? Basically, there's no language for that. At least I can't think of any.
Well, there might be no leverage. Certainly these kinds of media reports, though, it would have been quite possible to have one populist party publicly praise another populist party, agree with another populist party, congratulate another populist party. Most of, and I should mention, this data set does not include the original news reports. We have a group of eager undergraduates who have gone back in time trying to find them. They found some of them and they haven't found others. And I would say I'm sorry, I was going to take a list of questions, wasn't I?
Sorry, I just want to say that would it reflect a more deeper thing in the space is that the populist and populist interaction space is much narrower than a traditional party interaction space we have in the previous political system. It's because everything in the populist realm will collapse to so-called populism. So nothing is permitted there. It's not because they do not have conflict, it's because nothing to conflict about. So that's just a thought. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Luis?
Thank you. This was great. And happy birthday, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So,
How old am I? Let's just say the Beatles wrote a song about my birthday. That doesn't tell you how old I am. You need to listen to more Beatles music. Yeah.
So 2 quick questions. So one is like, if there is some way of accounting for how much talking and how much words there are, like you have like the Liebhardt finding, but Liebhardt was not only about just being nice, but he said this goes all the way to consensualizing in policy, and more redistribution, right? So this could be just an artifact of, in the UK, for example, the fact that they have these governing arrangements where they talk a lot, and you normalize, but if the denominator increases, there is more room for just talking smack. And any good UK politics TV show is how these people just talking across the aisle and saying crap to each other. So, I mean, this could be just, almost like a manipulation check what you're hiding, that there is more. So it would be nice to try to disentangle. So one thing to look at is maybe try to disaggregate speech that is just talking schmuck than actually the one that pertains to policy action. So if you find that in majoritarian systems, we see more interparty conflict when it comes to words that speak out policy disagreement, then that would be more meaningful finding.
Thanks. Thank you.
And the second question on the populism
Oh,
thing
sure, yeah.
is that, I mean, you didn't say much about how the words, how you conceptualize conflict, toxicity, whatever, because, well, I mean, it's actually, I agree with that. It's kind of a failed validity check that populists are not more conflict. They should be. By definition, that's what they do. They say, these are the elite, we are not, we hate them.
Yeah.
So if you don't pick that up,
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether there is something about the language, and this is what C was saying in a sense, right? So the language of populism is different. They're not talking like Cameron decrying someone or praise. They don't praise or decry the same way that Cameron does, which is kind of a Oxford educated person.
Yeah.
They would say, they talk about norms, right? So maybe trying to go back to this idea that populists attack norms and try to identify some kind of dictionary for norm breaking, right? So they're not going to criticize you in the regular way. They're going to talk about norms. This kind of thing that Trump said, like, lock her up. That's not insulting someone. It's a very formal procedural thing. There is a legal procedure for locking someone up. But that's really just crossing a red line as far as political norms. So I think maybe that's a way of picking up populist discourse, norms.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Samuel?
Yeah.
One, I'm missing a definition of populism.
So okay.
Two, you mentioned Leichhardt, but you didn't mention Sartori.
It's also very related to Sartori.
And when it comes to Sartori, that was positioned on a 1 to 10 scale, right? So it seems that the populists are in a different category. And three, I think that polarization in European party systems has increased enormously since 2019. And therefore, maybe you should look at this again with data which reflects the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
The 2020s.
Can I make a quick follow-up on that? I was wondering if you have any descriptives about evolution of conflict over time.
Yeah.
Because it seems that this is the era of the expansion of social networks, which create an incentive for politicians to be more aggressive.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, triangulation trends over time. Yeah. Glad you're interested in that, because that's another project we're working on. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. I
Thank you.
love looking at the research and the results. I think in line with everything, trying to make sense of the results on the non-populist attacks, and slightly on a different way of thinking about it, I was wondering if you had any interactions between if it is a populist party and the position in which the party is in government, because I think that could also be helpful to understand what's going on. Oftentimes, populist parties, before they reach power, they are more conflictive, but in some structures of government, once they are in power, they can moderate. It doesn't happen all the time, but maybe what I understand from the cordon sanitaire is that we would assume that non-populist parties are interacting with populist parties that are constant in their attacks, but maybe in some cases, once they are in power, they might actually moderate, and then the non-populist parties still attack, right? They're still trying to defend themselves, but maybe the populists are moderating. So it doesn't happen all the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a possibility
Well,
within the populist team.
thanks. And by the way, that's Adriana?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. As I said, bad sort of long-term vision even without these. Great, so let me try to take these, and we're down to like the last 5 minutes, correct?
Maybe 2 more minutes.
Okay, well then let me be very quickly. About why populists are, several of you have hit, and I'll group these together, about this finding, well, gee, why are populists not being conflictual with non-populist parties? Some of you have raised the question, is this some artifact of the way we're measuring it? Yeah, that's very helpful for me to know. We're gonna add this to the book, that it sounds like this is the one sort of non-finding that you're going, wait a minute, and you can think of reasons why we're missing something. That could indeed be the case. And Joe, your guess here, but well, you've got to make nice to these more than you would like to, maybe, to these non-populist parties, if they're ever going to actually accept you into government. I can certainly see that. Let's see. So Zia, you were talking about the populist space being narrower. And again, a lot of questions here related to populism. I think step number one, and this is another project I'm working on, we're going to do it, as I mentioned, working with several other folks about different ways of measuring illegal conflict besides legacy news reports. I think step one is just to see if this non-finding persists in other ways of doing it, or is it something about the legacy media or about relying almost largely on speech, less than on action that is actually what's going on. Let's see. Louise, just one other comment I jotted down while you were talking, and I'm now not sure quite exactly what I was thinking of, but you were talking about I think you were talking about all the talk that goes on and the amount of, say, public talking or debate there is, say, in Britain.
Maybe one way would be to control for amount of talking, lag or something, underlying levels of talking. That would be a way of perhaps, because you cannot have fixed effects there. Maybe we can talk about that, but I think if you normalize, then it's not what's driving the acrimony in the UK is that they talk more, but that if you control by
And I should mention, consistent with this intuition, there are more coded cases of interactions in Britain than in any other country, and that may be because of all the talking that they're doing. So thank you. That's a very good idea. Let's see. There was the question about. Well, a couple of you came up with issues related to what's happened since the data stopped in 2019. And we would love to know as well. So I have good news and bad news here. Good news is that Chris Falazian and Simon Weschel are working, and I should really give primary credit to Chris and Simon, who are doing the heavy lifting here, of extending these data up to 2022. So we're going to do a little bit more. The bad news is the integrated crisis early warning system project is over. The Defense Department has declared victory and gone home. And they did that, I want to say, the middle of 2023 or 2024. But it will be fascinating because your intuition, I think, was that there's more conflict now than there was in the period we're studying. We can check that, but only up to 2022, or I think maybe the middle of 2023. So that's the bad news on that. The question about what the trends look like over time, again, only going up to 2019. Last thing I'll say, because I don't want to trespass on your time, is Chris Falazian, Simon Weschel, and I have a project. I'm trying to talk them into this being the next Cambridge Elements booklet that we do. Although I'm sensing resistance to this idea, where we're tracking across all the countries with the most detailed coverage in this data set. There's about 7 of the countries, and 2 of them from outside. I think there's a lot on Canada, for example, but the 7 or 8 countries with the most coverage in the data set, we're tracking trends over time, both in parties' interactions with other political parties in the system. Because there are also codings, you can also track politicians' interactions with other politicians in the same party. So our parties becoming more or less internally divided. Also, party elites' interactions with other societal actors like labor unions, business associations, religious organizations, etc. And finally, their interactions with nonpartisan actors like the judiciary. So let me tell you what we've got so far. It surprised me. I'll see if it surprises you. All 4 of these dimensions, interacting inside your own party with other parties, nonpartisan actors, nonpartisan political actors, other societal actors. Number 1, there are big variations within countries over time. But number 2, if you take the average across all the countries, and these are, I think, 7 Western democracies, Canada, Australia, Germany, Britain, Spain, a couple of others. Okay, if you take the average and you plot it over time, it's stunningly stable. I feel, and maybe it's post 2019, things have erupted. Doesn't feel right to me, you know? I'm just telling you that at least based on what's being portrayed in the media, as this is at least coded in this data set, we're not seeing an uptick in any kind of conflict between parties and other actors or what have you. So you can take that as, gee, that's interesting, I didn't learn that, or that suggests problems with the data. Or something, maybe a problem with the way the media is covering it. But again, it's hard for me to believe that the media is systematically biased in the way that supports so many of the things we'd expect. And, you know, I can't believe there's a big project among the legacy media elite. We want to make Leipart look good while he's still alive. He's 89, but still going strong.
No subtitle.
All right, thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks.